I never set out to be a man who traded for another soul. That's the first truth I'll tell you. I wasn't out looking for salvation, not for myself, and sure as hell not for anyone else. I'd lived long enough to know the world didn't hand out grace for free. It always cost something. That day it cost me a sack of grain. The yard was hot enough to make the dirt crack wide, every step sinking in the kind of dust that sticks to your skin and doesn't let go. The shack leaned sideways, the barn half collapsed, fence posts giving up one by one. I'd seen plenty of places like it, homes turned prisons. The only thing standing straight was the man himself, her stepfather. Though he carried the same stink of rot I'd smelled on other men who thought cruelty was strength. She stood by the fence, arms crossed tight like she was trying to hold herself together. Her dress was 2 sizes too big, torn at the collarbone, sleeves rolled up over scabbed forearms. She didn't lift her eyes once, not to me, not to him. I'd seen that kind of silence before. It wasn't shyness, and it wasn't humility. It was what happens when life beats the words right out of you. I wasn't blind. She was young, 22, though you could have mistaken her for younger, with how small she looked standing there. But it wasn't youth that held her still. It was that blank look. The one people wear when they stop expecting good things. I knew it too well. Her stepfather spat and slapped the grain sack with his boot, grinning like he'd outsmarted me. "You got more of this?" he asked. Then he called out to someone, told them to get rid of her sister too if I was in the mood. I didn't answer, couldn't trust what might come out of my mouth. My leg ached from the long ride. That old break that never healed clean, and I leaned heavier on the wagon than I liked to admit. I climbed up slow, careful, every step dragging my left boot deeper in the dirt than the right. She didn't wait for me to help her. She didn't look for my hand. She climbed up on her own, quiet as the grave, and settled herself on the floorboard. The wagon turned while wheels kicking dust behind us. Not a soul from the shack waved goodbye. I kept my eyes on the road, the horses trotting steady. She kept hers on the ground, jaw locked tight. I wondered if she even cared where we were headed, or if she'd already left the world behind in her mind. I'd seen soldiers wear that same look after battles, men who were alive but no longer living. Truth is, I didn't bring her with me because I was noble. I didn't think of myself as a rescuer. I wasn't sure what I was at all. I only knew this: grain was easy to come by if you worked the land long enough. But a woman standing hollow-eyed in the dirt, like she'd been carved from stone, that wasn't easy to come by. That was something else. My place wasn't much better than the one she left. One story, square and solid, wood-worn gray from sun, with a roof that groaned when the wind blew. Barn was still standing though, and the corral held even if it was empty. No neighbors for miles, just dry land, cactus, and sky. Not a palace, not a dream, but it was mine, and it was quiet. So when we stopped, I climbed down first, careful with the legs, same as always. She stayed sitting there like she wasn't sure if stepping onto my dirt was any different than the dirt she'd just left behind. When I walked inside, she followed, slow, deliberate, like a shadow, testing whether it belonged in the light. I gave her a room. Not clean, not fine, but a bed, a blanket, 4 walls. 10 minutes later, I set a plate in front of her, 2 slices of bread, a mug of bitter coffee. It wasn't kindness, not the way most folks would see it. It was just what I had to give. She ate in silence, and I left her to it. That night, I lay awake longer than usual, listening to the house creak, listening to her footsteps shift soft against the floorboards. I kept wondering if she thought I'd taken her for myself, like her stepfather hinted. Maybe she thought I was just another kind of owner. Truth is, I didn't know what I was to her, not yet. What I did know was this. I'd seen too many graves dug too shallow, too many women and men left to die, because no one thought they were worth the trouble. And when I looked at her standing in that yard, barefoot and bruised, not even flinching when her own kin sold her for grain, I felt the same ache I'd carried since the war. I didn't need another mouth to feed. I didn't need another ghost in my house. But I wasn't going to leave her there. I couldn't. And maybe that's all this story is in the end. Not a rescue, not some grand romance. Just two people who'd had more taken from them than given, standing still long enough to see each other. So, before I tell you how the rest of it unfolded, I'll ask you something plain. If you're listening to this story, and it settles in you the way it settled in me, give it a sign, like the video, leave a comment, tell me where you're watching from. Follow the channel if you want to hear the rest. Because this isn't just Clara's story, it's mine too. And it began the day I traded a sack of grain for a girl who hadn't spoken in 3 months, because I knew she wasn't dead yet. The first days with her were quieter than most of the years I'd spent alone. I was used to silence. It had been my company for near a decade, filling the house after fever took my wife. Silence doesn't argue, it doesn't demand, it doesn't ask for more than you've got. It just sits there, heavy but steady, like an old dog that won't leave the porch. But when Clara came, that silence shifted. It wasn't mine anymore, it belonged to both of us, and somehow that made it feel different. Mornings came early. I'd be outside before the sun cleared the bluff, dragging my bad leg across the yard with a harness over my shoulder, shovel in, hand. The ground was still soft from night air, and I liked to use those hours to fix what needed fixing. Fences sag, roofs leak, boards rot, and a man either keeps up or loses it all. I never looked back towards the house, but I knew she was watching. I could feel the weight of her eyes from the doorway. Not curious, not trusting, just watchful, like an animal waiting to see which way a stranger turns before deciding whether to stay or bolt. She didn't say a word. Not that first day, not the second, not the third. But her hands started moving, and that was enough for me. I came in once to find the kitchen swept clean. The dust chased out of corners I hadn't touched in months. Another time, I saw the firewood stacked neatly under the lean-to, smaller logs, cut fine enough for kindling. She didn't look at me when I noticed. She just kept moving, sleeves rolled, eyes down, like she was waiting for correction. I didn't give it. I let her be. On the 4th day, I set a bucket of well water beside the door before she woke. When she stepped out and saw it, she paused, hands tightening at her sides. Then she lifted it and carried it in without a word. That was the first trade we made. One chore for another, a quiet understanding that didn't need talking. At night, she ate what I put in front of her. Bread, potatoes, sometimes beans if I'd saved any. She ate slow, careful, like she wasn't sure it would last. I didn't press. I just sat across from her, my own plate in front of me, and let the fire do the talking. Her face in the lamplight looked younger when she wasn't clenching her jaw. Still hard, still worn, but not broken through. One evening, I pulled the second chair closer to the fire. Usually, I kept it pushed back, left it tucked away like the house was only meant for one. But that night, after she finished sweeping the porch, I left it waiting. She came in, saw it, and froze for a heartbeat. Then she sat. Didn't glance at me, didn't smile, but she sat, and we watched the flames burn down together until the embers glowed red and faint. That was more conversation than I'd had in years. I never asked her why she worked so hard, why she swept and stacked and carried water like she'd been hired on. I already knew. Work steadies the mind when the soul's been shaken. It gives your hands something to do when your heart won't quiet. I didn't stop her because I remembered what it felt like to need that rhythm, to wake each morning and lay hold of something solid just to keep the dark away. Sometimes when the wind caught the shutters just right, I'd see her flinch, her shoulders tightening like she was bracing for something. Other times when my boots creaked across the floor too sudden, her eyes flicked up sharp, wide, before she forced them back down. Those were the moments I wanted to tell her she was safe, but words like that don't mean much when you've had them broken too many times. So I kept still. I lit the lamp at night and left it burning low. A small thing, but maybe enough to ease her into sleep. By the end of that first week, I noticed her movements weren't as cautious. She carried the broom without waiting for me to nod. She tended the fire before I came in from the barn. Once, I caught her humming under her breath while she scrubbed the tin cup, faint and quick, like she forgot herself for a moment. She stopped when she saw me watching, but I'd heard it, and it stayed with me long after. I didn't know what to make of her yet. She wasn't a guest, and she wasn't a servant. She wasn't my wife. Though sometimes when I passed the closed door of her room, the thought stung sharper than I liked to admit. She was just there, in the house, in the silence, moving around the edges of my life, until the edges didn't feel so sharp anymore. At night, lying in my bed, listening to her steps settle, I thought about what it meant to bring someone back to a place that had held only ghosts. I thought about my wife's chair, the way she used to drag it close to the stove, and how Clara now sat across from me in the same glow of firelight. I wondered if I was wrong to let it happen, if maybe I was betraying the memory of what once was. But then, I'd hear Clara shift in the other room, hear the faint creak of the floorboards, and the sound was enough to remind me the house was alive again. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. I didn't know if she'd ever find her voice again, or if she'd leave when the chance came. But I knew this. The silence didn't weigh as heavy anymore, and sometimes that's all a man needs to keep going. It's a strange thing, how trust doesn't show itself in grand gestures, but in the smallest movements that most men wouldn't bother noticing. I'd lived enough years alone to know when something shifted in the air, and with Clara it came slow, like dawn creeping across the ridge without fanfare. One morning I came in from mending the corral, dirt heavy on my boots, back stiff from bending too long. The floor of the kitchen was swept smooth, not a speck of dust in the corners, and the table had been wiped down to bare grain. The broom leaned against the wall, and I could see her hands were raw from holding it, knuckles pink against the wood. She didn't wait for me to comment. She just set down the cloth she was using and went to stoke the fire. I didn't say anything, but I felt something in my chest ease, like a beam settling into place. The next day there was a pile of firewood, stacked under the lean-to, neat and squared. She must have carried every stick herself, small frame bent under the weight, because I hadn't cut that wood in months. I stood there a long while looking at it, not because I needed the help, but because someone had cared enough to do it. When I brought in water the following morning and left the bucket by the door, I didn't expect her to notice, but she did. She stood in the doorway, eyes lingering a second too long on the bucket before she bent to lift it. No words passed between us, but I counted it as the first agreement we made, silent, steady, and binding in its own way. At night, she kept to her own room, but I knew she moved quiet through the house after I'd settled near the fire. Sometimes I'd hear her checking the latch on the back door, or I'd see her shadow pass by the kitchen window. She wasn't restless. She was measuring the place, seeing if it would hold her weight without splintering. I let her. Every woman deserves to know if the ground beneath her is steady. On the fourth evening, I did something small, but it felt like a risk. I pulled the second chair closer to the fire before she came in. What? Usually it stayed tucked away, empty, a reminder of what I'd lost. This time, I left it out. When she walked in from sweeping the porch, her eyes caught on it. She froze just a breath, like she wasn't sure if it was meant for her. Then she sat. Didn't speak, didn't look at me, but she sat. We stayed there until the flames burned low. The silence between us no longer sharp, but softer, like it had room to breathe. I noticed little things after that. The way she no longer waited for me to nod before carrying out a chore. The way she stepped into the yard with a purpose. Sleeves rolled, hair falling loose in the wind. I saw her humming once as she scrubbed a pot at the basin, so quiet she might not have even realized it slipped out. When her eyes caught mine, she stopped, but the sound lingered in the room long after. It wasn't much, but for someone who hadn't spoken a word since she'd come, it felt like a bell tolling across the flats. She started eating without hesitation too. Those first nights she'd picked at her food, slow and careful, like she thought it might be taken away. But now she finished her plate and set it down steady, almost like she knew it would be filled again tomorrow. I didn't mention it, though I wanted to. Some things are better left unspoken, allowed to grow on their own without a man's hand trying to shape them. There were still shadows in her, I could see it plain. Sometimes a gust of wind would rattle the shutters, and her shoulders would lock up tight, as if she expected a hand at her arm or a voice shouting her name. Other times, my boots creaking across the floor made her flinch before she caught herself. I wanted to tell her she was safe here, but words like that sound hollow when you've heard them used as lies. Instead, I lit the lamp each night and left it burning until dawn. I never told her why, but she noticed. I could see it in the way her breathing steadied when she passed the doorway. One afternoon, I was fixing a rail near the corral when I saw her step out of the house with a pitchfork in hand. She didn't ask. She just walked up, set her jaw, and started helping me clear the stable. Her movements were clumsy at first, the fork heavier than she expected, but she didn't stop. When I handed her the bucket of feed without looking at her and she took it like it had been meant for her all along, I felt something shift. Not big, not loud, but solid. An unspoken agreement that we were working the same ground now. I'd lost count of how many days had passed since she arrived. The sun came up, the work got done, the sun went down. But the silence between us wasn't the same silence I'd lived with before. It wasn't the kind that gnawed at your ribs and reminded you of who wasn't there anymore. It was a silence that carried weight, but not sorrow. Like something was building beneath it, waiting for the right moment to break through. And maybe that's what trust really is, not a word spoken, not even a promise given, but the simple act of reaching for a bucket and knowing the other hand won't pull away. I never much cared for going into Ashri flats. Towns are noisy in their own way, even the small ones. Too many eyes, too many voices chewing over things that ain't theirs to chew. I lived better, keeping to my land, mending what I could and ignoring the rest. But there are some supplies you can't raise from dirt. And after Clara had been with me near a week, I knew I couldn't put it off. Coffee was low, nails too. Soap was gone altogether. That morning, I hitched the wagon, kept my head down while I worked the harness. When I looked up, she was standing in the doorway with her shawl pulled tight, watching me like she wasn't sure if she was meant to come or stay behind. I motioned to the seat beside me. She climbed up without a word, shoulders stiff, face turned away. The road into town stretched long and dust-heavy. We rode in silence, the wheels thumping steady against hard ground. I could feel her draw smaller beside me, like she wanted to fold herself into nothing before we reached those boardwalks. I didn't speak. I never did, unless there was need. But I kept my hands steady on the reins, so she'd know at least the horses wouldn't falter. Ashri Flats looked the same as it always had. Wood warped by sun, signs faded near to blank, men arguing outside the blacksmith's shed, women sweeping dust that would be back by the hour. But that morning I saw it through her eyes. Every stare cut sharper, every whisper clung heavier, and it wasn't me they were looking at. "The Dalton girl," I heard one woman hiss under her breath, loud enough she wanted it caught. Another man leaned against a post, grinning, eyes following Clara like she'd carried her shame into town in a basket. Clara pulled her shawl tighter, head bent low, her jaw tight as stone. I hated it, hated how they looked at her, like she was a thing instead of a person. But I kept walking, kept my pace even. Sometimes the best way to shut a man's mouth is to act like you don't hear him. Inside of the general store, the air smelled of flour and tobacco. The bell above the door gave its weak jingle. I pulled a folded scrap of paper from my pocket and handed it to her. Coffee, soap, flowers. Though I didn't know why I wrote that one down. Nails. My handwriting was blocky, the kind a schoolmarm once called near illegible. But Clara studied it careful and nodded once. She went off to gather what was listed while I waited at the counter. She moved cautious through the aisles, but her hands didn't shake. When she set the items down, the shopkeeper eyed her long before he touched the goods. Then he looked at me, lips pulling into a grin I'd seen too many times on men who thought they had you cornered. "She yours now, Morrow?" he asked, leaning heavy against the wood. The words hit harder than I let on. My stomach twisted hot, but I didn't show it. I set the coins down slow and flat on the counter. "She's here to work," I said. That was all. I turned and walked out the door, not looking back to see if Clara followed. But she did. I heard her steps quicken behind me, heard the catch in her breath she tried to hide. I kept my eyes on the wagon, hands steady as I took the reins again. We rode out the way we came, quiet as before. But this time the silence was thick with something else. I thought about what the shopkeeper said all the way home. "She yours now." As if a person could be owned, traded, claimed like land or cattle. I wondered if Clara thought the same, if she believed I was just another man holding the deed to her life. The thought sickened me, though I couldn't blame her if she did. Back at the ranch, she slipped off the wagon without waiting for me and went straight inside. I unhitched the horses slow, giving her the time she seemed to need. By the time I stepped through the doorway, she was at the stove setting the coffee on the flame like it had been her idea all along. I sat at the table, watching her hands move steady, the shawl still draped across her shoulders. The thing about Clara is she never asked for pity. Not once. But when the townsfolk stared at her like she was dirt, I wanted to set the whole place straight. Instead, all I could give her was a chair pulled out, a lamp lit, and a few words plain enough to matter when they needed saying. That night, she ate her supper in silence. But I saw her pause once, eyes flicking to me when she thought I wasn't watching. Like she was measuring whether I'd claim her the way the shopkeeper suggested. I didn't. I only sat there steady as I could, letting her see that silence between us was hers to fill when she chose, not mine to demand. It wasn't rescue I'd offered her. It wasn't ownership either. It was just space. Space enough to sit at my table. Space enough to breathe without someone's hand at her arm. And if the world wanted to twist that into something else, let it. I knew the truth, and in time, I hoped she would too. Nights on the flats carry a certain sound. The wind finds every crack in the shutters. The boards in the roof groan like they're remembering storms long past, and the fire whispers as it settles into ash. I'd grown used to those sounds filling the space where conversation might have been. But one evening, after weeks of nothing but silence, another voice cut through, hers. The day had been long. I'd spent most of it hauling boards for the back fence, my leg aching sharper than usual. She had taken to the small tasks without me asking, sweeping, washing, moving what wood she could carry. And by dusk she was at the stove, boiling potatoes with a pinch of dried onion. The house smelled stronger than it had in years, not good cooking exactly, but steady food. When she set the pot aside, I was stacking kindling by the hearth. That's when it came. Her voice was low, careful, as if she wasn't sure the words would come out at all. "Why'd you bring me here?" I froze, hands still on the wood. I looked at her, and she held my eyes for the first time since she'd stepped onto my land. There wasn't anger in her gaze, not even fear. Just the raw edge of wanting to understand. I thought about lying. I thought about telling her I needed help on the ranch, or that the trade was fair enough, or that it didn't matter. But her face wouldn't allow it. She deserved more than the half-truths I'd carried most of my life. "Didn't sit right," I said finally. My voice came out rougher than I intended. "What they did, what he did. I've buried too many people already. You weren't dead yet." Her lips parted like she was about to say something more, but nothing came. She turned back to scrubbing the pot, shoulders tight, but I saw the way her hands trembled against the tin. I wanted to tell her I hadn't planned any of it, that I'd gone there for grain and nothing else, that I wasn't a savior, and I wasn't looking for company. But when I saw her fingers clutching that pot, I knew the truth was simple enough. I couldn't leave her in that yard, not when her eyes told me she'd already been left too many times. She didn't answer me that night. She finished her cleaning, set the pot aside, and disappeared into her room. But I lay awake long after, staring at the ceiling, hearing her voice repeat in my head. The first words she'd given me, simple as they were, had shifted something I couldn't name. The next morning, I left the lamp burning low in the front room when the wind picked up before dawn. I didn't know if she noticed, but when I passed her door, the air inside seemed calmer. Later, when she came out to the yard and stood near me while I hammered a loose board, she asked another question. "Your leg," she said, eyes steady on the way I shifted my weight. "What happened?" I hesitated, then answered plain. "Horse fell 7 years ago, broke clean through, took a long time to walk again." She nodded once, like she was taking stock, then asked, "Your wife?" "Gone 5 years now." "Fever?" "Fever." That was all. She didn't press, and I didn't explain. But there was something in the way she asked. Straightforward, no pity, no prying, that settled into me like a bomb. She wanted to know, not to dig, but to piece together who I was. That evening when I pulled her chair out before she sat at the table, she didn't hesitate. She slid into it and ate beside me, the firelight flickering across her face. She didn't thank me. She didn't need to. It was enough that she stayed. Over the next days, her voice came in small doses. A question about the pasture, a comment about the weather, a quiet hum under her breath when she thought I wasn't listening. And every time I let her set the pace, I didn't push. I didn't ask for more than she offered. I knew how easy it was to scare words back into silence, and I wasn't about to do it. One night, after the fire had burned low and the shutters rattled with the wind, I heard her stir in the other room. Her footsteps came across the floor bare and soft, until she stood near the lamp I'd left burning. She didn't speak, but she didn't turn back either. She just stood there in the glow, breathing steady, as if the light itself was the answer she'd been searching for. That's when I realized what those first words had meant. They weren't just questions, they were tests. She was measuring me, seeing if my answers matched my actions, if I'd give her space when she needed it or slam it shut like a door. And though I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, I knew I'd passed at least that first test. The evening he came back. The air was heavy with that stillness you only notice after living years in the desert. The sky had turned a red so deep it looked like the horizon was burning and the wind had died altogether. I just finished cutting kindling when the sound of hooves broke that silence. Not hurried, not lost, just steady, deliberate, the kind of sound a man makes when he knows where he's going. Clara was inside, folding a blanket near the fire. I set the hatchet aside and stepped to the porch. The gate creaked as he dismounted, boots sinking into the dirt. I knew it was him before I heard his voice. A man carries his cruelty like a smell, and hers carried strong. He staggered a little, drunk or pretending to be, and grinned when he saw me. "Morrow," he slurred, "that grain you brought me was foul, rotten clear through. I'll take the girl back and we'll call it square." I didn't answer. I leaned against the post, my bad leg holding stiff, and let him run his mouth. Men like him feed on reaction. Give them none, and it starves them quicker than a bullet. He took a step closer, spitting into the dust. "You think she's yours now? She ain't. She's mine by right. Been mine since the day her mama died. You're just a cripple hiding behind another man's cast-off." Behind me, I heard the faint scrape of Clara's chair against the floor. She was listening, her breath caught sharp. I didn't turn. Turning would have only fed his fire. "Deal was made," I said finally, voice low and even. "Grain's gone, so is the girl." For a long moment, the air between us held tight. He blinked like he hadn't expected me to answer so plain. Then he laughed, sharp and ugly, the sound carrying across the yard. "You think you can stand against me? You limp like a half-dead mule. One push and you'd fall flat." I didn't move. I let his words hang there. Then I shifted just enough for him to see the rifle resting against the doorframe inside, not lifted, not pointed, just waiting. His eyes caught it, and I saw the edge of his grin falter. "You send her out," he barked, voice turning hard. "Now." I shook my head once. "She ain't stepping back onto your land, not tonight, not ever." The silence after that was heavier than the sunset. He shifted his weight, looking like he might reach for the pistol at his hip, but I knew drunks. I knew cowards. His hand twitched, then fell. He spat again, turned back to his horse, and swung into the saddle with more effort than grace. "This ain't over," he called, tugging the reins. "She's property, Morrow. You can't change that." He rode off slow, his words trailing in the dust. But I stayed there on the porch until the sound of hooves faded completely. Only then did I step back inside. Clara was standing by the fireplace, her face pale, hands shaking. She looked at me like she wasn't sure if I'd hand her over after all, like she still hadn't dared to believe I'd hold my ground. "He's gone," I said, setting the latch on the door. "He won't get through the gate if he comes back." She swallowed, her voice thin. "How can you be sure?" I looked at her, steady. "Because I won't let him." Her eyes filled then, not with tears exactly, but with something harder to carry. The weight of being believed, being defended without condition. She sat slowly, as if her legs couldn't hold her, and stared into the fire. I wanted to go to her, to put my hand over hers, but I stayed where I was. Sometimes space is the only gift a man can give. Instead, I added another log to the flames, letting the crackle fill the silence he'd left behind. That night, as the wind picked up and rattled the shutters, I checked the rifle twice. I set boards across the back gate and tested the latch on the barn. I'd done these things before, but now it wasn't just for me. I wasn't guarding memories anymore. I was guarding someone who'd already had too much stolen. When I finally lay down, I heard her moving in the next room. Her steps were soft, pacing once, twice before settling. I wondered if she knew the truth, that my words on the porch hadn't been meant as threat. They'd been a promise. Not because I saw her as mine, not because I owed her, but because I couldn't stomach another grave, another life crushed under a man's boot. She didn't thank me. She didn't need to. The way her breathing steadied as the night stretched on told me enough. And as I closed my eyes, I knew one thing sure. If he came back, drunk or armed or spitting his lies, he'd find me waiting. And this time, I wouldn't just speak. After her stepfather rode away that night, something in the air between us shifted. It wasn't gone, the fear, the memory of what he'd said, but it had loosened its grip. Clara still moved quiet through the house, still kept her words close. But the weight she carried wasn't the same. It was lighter somehow, like she'd seen with her own eyes that I wasn't going to hand her over. Maybe she still didn't know why I'd stood my ground, but she knew I had, and that was enough for her to take her first steps toward me. It started in the smallest ways. One morning I came in from the barn to find her already at the stove, sleeves rolled up, stirring beans with a steady hand. She didn't wait for me to sit before placing a plate on the table. She didn't look at me either, but the act spoke louder than any words could have. I sat, ate what she gave, and let her see that I trusted her cooking as much as I trusted her presence. Later that week, I found her in the yard, broom in hand, sweeping the porch in slow, measured strokes. The morning light caught her hair loose around her face, and though she didn't see me watching, I noticed something new. She wasn't moving just to pass the time anymore. She was moving like the place belonged to her, like the dust on the porch was hers to chase out. And then came the day of the corral. I was pitching old hay when she walked out from the house, skirts brushing against her boots, and lifted the pitchfork without being told. I passed her a bucket, half expecting her to hesitate, but she didn't. She took it clean, carried it steady, and set it down where it belonged. We didn't exchange a word, but in that silence, we struck something truer than speech. It was an agreement, unspoken, quiet, that we were working the same ground together. The first time I saw her smile, it startled me. We'd saddled the mare, and I'd shown her the reins, careful to give her space. She climbed up awkward at first, jaw tight, shoulders stiff, but after a few laps around the corral, Her grip loosened. The horse moved steady beneath her. The morning wind touched her face. And all at once her lips curved soft and quick, like she'd forgotten to hold it back. It wasn't wide, not lasting, but it was real, and it lit something in me I thought had gone out years ago. I looked away before she noticed, but I carried that image with me long after. The way the sun touched her face, the way the heaviness seemed to fall from her for just a breath. That evening she sat across from me by the fire, patching a tear in her dress. Her fingers moved sure with the needle, and though she didn't lift her eyes, I caught her humming again. This time she didn't stop when she saw me listening. She just kept on, low and even, like the sound was more for herself than for me. I didn't interrupt. I let it fill the room, and for the first time in years, the silence of the house didn't feel empty. Clara started asking small things too, testing her voice as much as my answers. She asked how my leg had broken, and I told her plain. She asked about my wife, and I gave her the truth, short and steady. 7 years married. Fever took her in the 8th spring. I didn't say more, and she didn't press, but the way she listened told me it mattered that I'd shared even that much. One night after supper, she stepped outside without a word. I watched her from the window, sitting on the porch step with her arms folded around her knees. The stars hung sharp above her, and though she looked small against that wide sky, she didn't look broken. I thought about going out, about sitting beside her, but I stayed inside and left the lamp burning instead. When she came back in, her eyes flicked towards the light, and I knew she'd seen what I meant by it. The next day she surprised me again. We were working near the barn when she turned suddenly and said, "I want to learn to shoot." Her voice didn't waver. I studied her a long moment before I answered. "Tomorrow, we'll start early." She nodded, nothing more. But I saw the way her shoulders settled after I agreed, like she'd taken back a piece of ground she thought she'd lost forever. That night, as we sat across from each other, her sewing in hand and my knife working down a piece of pine, she lifted her eyes for the first time without fear. Not for long, but long enough to let me know she was beginning to see me not as another man to survive, but as someone she might stand beside. And that's when I realized what had changed. It wasn't that her stepfather had left. It wasn't that the threats were gone. They weren't. It was that Clara herself was changing. She was finding her voice in the smallest of ways, in a smile, in a question, in the way she carried a bucket without waiting for command. And for me, a man who thought his life had ended the day fever carried his wife to the grave, it felt like watching a seed push through hard earth, quiet, steady, unexpected, but alive all the same. There's a heaviness that comes with holding too much inside. I'd carried mine for years tucked into the quiet corners of this ranch. Clara had hers too. I could see it in the way her shoulders tightened when the wind rattled the shutters, or how her eyes darted toward shadows, like she expected something to step out of them. We didn't speak of it at first. We just lived alongside each other, letting the silence do the work words might have ruined. But one night the past came forward, uninvited, and neither of us turned it away. It was late. The fire had burned down low, only embers left glowing red. Clara was patching a sleeve in her lap, her fingers moving steady through the fabric. I was whittling at a strip of pine, shaving curls to nothing, my knife working more out of habit than purpose. For a long time, the only sound was the scrape of steel against wood. Then, without looking up, I said, "My wife used to sit in that chair." Her hands stilled. She lifted her eyes toward me. quiet, waiting. I hadn't meant to say it out loud, but the words were already in the air. She was smaller than you, I went on, my voice low. But she always dragged it closer to the stove, said she hated the draft that came through the floorboards. How long? Clara asked softly. 7 years, I answered. Fever took her in the 8th spring. I didn't say her name. I didn't speak of the way her laughter used to fill this room or how the house turned hollow after she left. Some things hurt more in the telling, and I wasn't sure I could bear it. But Clara didn't press. She just nodded once as if to say she'd heard me, and turned back to her sewing. The quiet that followed wasn't sharp. It wasn't the kind that cuts. It was gentle, like a blanket pulled close. For the first time in a long while, I felt lighter, as if saying even that much had set something down I'd been carrying too long. A few nights later, it was her turn. We were outside, the air cool with the scent of rain coming in from the ridge. She stood near the corral, her hand trailing along the rail, eyes fixed on the dark horizon. I joined her, leaning on the post, waiting. I used to wish he'd die, she said suddenly. Her voice was steady, though her hands gripped the wood. My stepfather. After what he did, what he allowed, I wished it every night. I looked at her, but she kept her eyes on the distance. Then I stopped, she went on. It's not because I forgave him, just because hoping felt like a waste, like waiting for a miracle that was never going to come. I let her words settle. Then I said, sometimes stopping the hurt isn't justice, it's survival. She turned her head toward me then, her eyes searching mine. You ever want to hurt someone? I thought of the war. I thought of the men I'd shot, the graves I'd left behind, the faces that still haunted me in the dark. My jaw tightened. I have, I admitted, but wanting and doing aren't the same. She breathed out slow, like she'd been holding it in too long. For a while, we stood there in silence, the stars sharp above us, the ground cool under our boots. Then she said, almost to herself, I don't want to be afraid anymore. You don't have to be, I told her. And I meant it, even if I wasn't sure how to make it true. The days that followed carried a different rhythm. Clara's voice came more often, in small ways. She asked me about fence posts, about when the rains might come, about the horses. I answered plain, steady, because I knew she wasn't asking just for knowledge. She was asking to see if I'd still give without taking. One afternoon, I found her in the barn, standing by the cross I'd planted years back with my wife's initials carved in the grain. She knelt there, not in mourning, not in pity, but in something quieter, almost respect. When she rose, her face was calmer than I'd ever seen it. She didn't mention what she'd done, and I didn't ask. But later that night, when I set 2 plates on the table, she met my eyes and nodded like she was agreeing to something we hadn't spoken. Trust, I realized, isn't about promises. It isn't about the words we string together to make sense of the hurt. It's about moments, small, steady ones, where the truth slips through. Me telling her about my wife, her telling me about her stepfather. Neither of us had to say more than a few sentences, but it was enough to know we were no longer carrying it all alone. And for a man who thought his life was finished, and for a woman who thought hers had been stolen, that was the beginning of something I never expected, room to breathe again. By the time August bled into September, the land was bone dry again. The well dropped a half foot, and the chickens had grown quiet with the heat. Work stayed the same, mending what I could, keeping the animals fed. But something inside the house had shifted. Clara was different. She moved slower in the mornings, her appetite sharpened, her sleep deeper. At first she said nothing, just went on with her chores as if nothing had changed, but I knew. I'd lived close enough to life and death to see the signs plain. One morning, she stood in front of the mirror, wearing one of my shirts over her dress. The fabric hung loose, but her hands rested at her stomach in a way I couldn't ignore. When I came in from hauling water, she turned to me, eyes steady, though her voice was quiet. "I think I'm pregnant." The words landed heavy and bright all at once. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with something deeper, something I hadn't felt in years. I set down the tin cups I was carrying and stepped to her. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Not yet," she said. "But something feels different." I took her hands in mine, rough and worn as they were, and held them against me. "Then we'll be ready," I told her. And I meant it. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. But her shoulders softened, and for Clara, that said more than tears or laughter ever could. Over the next weeks, the signs became clearer. She ate more, hummed more, grew quieter, in ways that weren't fear, but reflection, like she was taking measure of her new life and what it would hold. I didn't push her to speak about it. I simply went on with the work, but I started pulling down boards from the loft to build a cradle. When she saw me hammering it together one afternoon, she didn't ask what it was for. She just stood in the doorway, hands folded over her stomach, watching. We didn't sleep apart anymore. Each night she came to my bed, not out of fear, not out of obligation, but choice. Sometimes we spoke, sometimes we didn't. The quiet between us wasn't survival anymore. It was presence. It was enough. One evening, after a long day patching the roof before the cold set in, we sat across from each other at the table. Clara was sewing a small bonnet from scrap cloth. I watched her fingers, delicate but certain, moving thread through fabric as though she'd done it all her life. She looked up once and said, almost shy, "I never thanked you." "For what?" I asked. "For never sending me back, for giving me a life." I shook my head, leaned forward, and set my hand over hers. "You made the life. I just gave you room to build it." Her eyes filled, steady and unflinching, and then she said it, words I hadn't expected, words that lit the air between us. "I love you." For a long moment I couldn't speak. My throat tightened, my chest heavy with all I'd carried for years. Then I leaned close, resting my forehead against hers. "I love you too." It was the only time either of us had said it out loud, and it was enough. Not long after, I asked her the question that had been sitting in me for weeks. We were lying in bed, the window cracked open to let in the sound of crickets and coyotes. I turned to her in the dark and said, "You want my name?" She turned toward me, searching my face. "You offering?" "I'm asking," I said. "Not because you need it, because I want you to have it." She let out a quiet breath, her hand finding mine beneath the blanket. "Then yes." We didn't ride into town with fanfare. We didn't gather a crowd or find a preacher. When the time came, we stood beneath the old oak behind the house, boots sunk into warm soil, hands clasped together. The papers from town were signed and folded, nothing more than ink on paper. But that wasn't the marriage. The marriage was the way she looked at me when she braided her hair that morning, the way I trimmed my beard, the way we faced each other with nothing to hide. Clara wore the calico dress with the white flowers faded from washings but still whole. I wore a clean shirt and the same boots I'd worn the day I took her from that yard. We looked like ourselves. Nothing more, nothing less. That's all we needed. Afterward, we ate supper on the porch, the sun dipping low behind the ridge. Clara leaned into me, her hand resting over the small swell of her stomach, more visible now. I kissed her temple and said only, "You're safe." She nodded, and I believed it as much as she did. The days that followed weren't easier, but they were ours. Clara sewed small garments from scraps of cloth, her humming filling the house like it hadn't in years. I finished the cradle and set it beside the hearth, running my hand over the smooth pine. We argued once quietly about where the chickens ought to stay. She won. I let her. The ranch wasn't haunted anymore. It was alive again, with her voice, her laughter when it came, her presence in every room. And as I watched her moving through this house that had once felt like a grave, I knew the truth plain. Clara wasn't a girl traded for grain anymore. She was my wife, the mother of the child we were about to welcome, and the steady fire that had brought me back to life. The land has a way of holding memory. You walk the same stretch of dirt long enough, and every crack in the earth, every leaning post, every shadow cast at dusk reminds you of what came before. When I first built this place, it held laughter and a woman's voice. Then it turned hollow, carrying only the echo of what I'd lost. For years I thought that was all it would ever be, a house where silence lived, a ranch run by a man who'd stopped expecting anything good. Now, when I step outside at first light, I hear something else. Clara humming low while she stirs the stove, the chickens fussing because she's already scattered feed before I've even pulled on my boots. The sound of her voice, soft and steady, is proof enough that a man can be wrong about what the world has left for him. The baby's not here yet, but already the house feels full. The cradle I built sits beside the hearth, smooth pine polished from the hours I spent shaping it. Her sewing gathers on the table, little garments pieced together from scraps she refused to waste. I catch her smiling now, not often and not loud, but in a way that lingers long after. Sometimes I'll glance at her across the firelight and see her palm resting absent-minded on her belly, and my chest tightens with something too big for words. There are nights I lie awake, listening to her breathing beside me, and I wonder how I came to this. I traded a sack of grain for a girl I barely knew, and I thought it would end there. But it didn't. It was the start of something I didn't expect, something I'd thought was beyond my reach. I didn't save her, and she didn't save me. What we did was harder. We stayed. We chose each other when walking away would have been easier. Her stepfather never came back, not once. Word traveled that he'd tried to stir up talk in town, saying I'd cheated him, saying Clara belonged to him still. But talk is wind, and wind scatters fast. Folks saw her standing beside me in the store, saw the way she carried herself different, saw the ring of steadiness in her eyes. They stopped calling her Dalton's girl. Now she's Clara Morrow, and that name holds weight not because I gave it, but because she chose it. I've learned things I never expected to learn at my age. That silence doesn't have to mean emptiness. That trust can be built without words, through a bucket passed from one hand to another, or a lamp left burning when the night gets too dark. That love doesn't always roar in like a storm. It can come soft, steady, until one day you realize it's woven through every corner of your life. Sometimes when I walk out to the ridge and look over the valley, I think about the man I was before Clara came here. I was half alive, moving through the days like I was just waiting for the ground to take me. I never thought I'd build again. But then I remember the first time I saw her smile, small and quick atop the mare. And I know I'll carry that sight with me longer than the memory of any grave. She tells me often, I don't want to be afraid anymore. And every time I answer the same, you don't have to be. I don't say it to comfort her. I say it because it's true. Fear may still knock on the door, but it doesn't live here anymore. What lives here is steadiness, firelight, the sound of her voice, and the promise of the child we're about to welcome. If you've stayed with me through this telling, then you know by now it isn't a story about rescue. It isn't about a man sweeping in to fix what was broken. It's about two people learning that broken doesn't mean finished. That even when the past claws at your heels, you can still plant your feet and choose something different. I look at Clara now, her hair falling loose in the lamplight, her face softened by the quiet safety of this house, and I know one thing for certain. I didn't bring her here to save her. I brought her here because I saw she wasn't dead yet. And somewhere along the way, she showed me I wasn't either. So if you're hearing this, let it be a reminder. Don't turn your back on the small beginnings. Don't believe the lie that nothing good is left for you. Sometimes all it takes is a chair pulled closer to the fire, a hand reaching back when you thought no one would. That's how a home is built. That's how love returns. And before I let this story rest, I'll ask you plain. If it settled something in you, if you saw a piece of yourself in it, show it. Like this video so others might find it. Leave a comment. Tell us where you're watching from. Share what it stirred in you. And if you want to hear more stories like mine, stories of the Wild West, of loss and love, and what it means to choose again, follow this channel. Because this life we've built, this fire that keeps burning, it isn't just ours. It's a reminder for anyone who's ever thought they were too far gone. We're proof that even after everything is taken, there's still room to begin again.